to see if it works.
You should be able to show it
Kind of,
screen.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's really. It's sort of.
It's already got
Share screen.
Oh,
It's
cool.
be brought us down. Yeah.
And it's this one, right?
Right.
It should be.
Okay.
Yeah, it's that one
Or is it desktop 2?
maybe. Yeah,
Or is it
try that
desktop?
one.
Desktop 2. Is that it?
It looks like it.
Okay. All right. Do y'all see the PowerPoint slides?
Oh, I guess we have to click on share.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Oh, great.
All right, we're set. All right.
Let me stop sharing for now and then we'll do the introduction.
So I should stop share for right now.
We'll get it after the talk. I mean, you might want to actually stand in front because he's now not sharing his screen.
Okay, I don't have to be in the camera though.
You would want to be because otherwise we can't. They
So-
can't hear you.
Oh, it's
Share
because,
screen.
yeah. No, you don't have to
No, no,
share
no.
screen right now. But, oh, maybe you want to stand here so that people can see us. Sorry.
We'll get through this. Thanks for your patience.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming, joining us today for Dr. David H. Kim's talk. It gives me so much pleasure to introduce Dr. Kim to you. David is a professor of philosophy at the University of San Francisco. He has published numerous articles in the philosophy of race, decolonial thought, moral psychology, and comparative philosophy. And recent publications include Asian American Philosophy and Feminism in the Oxford Handbook of Feminist Philosophy, and Racist Love in 50 Concepts for Critical Phenomenology, and Alterity, Analytics, and the Challenge of Epistemic Decolonization in the Southern Journal of Philosophy. And some of the works that really inspired me that David has done, Dr. Kim has done,
David's fine.
what is Asian American philosophy in Philosophy in Multiple Voices, and a second article, Shame and Self-Revision in Asian American Assimilation in Living Alterities, Phenomenology, Race, and Embodiment. And his current research is on East-South decolonial dialogue that focuses on shared political struggle and resources for theoretical hybridity in the wider South and or non-West. We can ask him about that later. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Dr. Kim.
And do I need to share screen or do we already
Yes,
press that?
you. That's right now
Okay.
we're seeing your head.
Okay. Oh. Oops. I'm sorry, I just lost the entire screen for
Okay.
those who are on
Let me
Zoom.
see.
Guess I will collapse this. I thought we were.
I see. Let's see.
Sorry, one more.
Go back.
Oh,
to
there we go,
Zoom
okay.
And then
Oh, there we go.
screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And we did desktop too, right?
Uh-huh.
Share. Okay. We're in business.
Okay.
Y'all can see from home? Okay, great. All right, thank you. First of all, thank you for your patience. I'm just delighted to be here. I think like so many of you, the impact of COVID has meant, not just sheltering in place, but sheltering your mind and cramping what would otherwise be sharing of thoughts. And so this is like, this is now I went to the Pacific APA, so this is the second time I've done any type of academic travel. So it's twice in like the last couple of weeks. And so I'm really excited about just sharing some ideas. it's still in kind of rough draft form. So I'd love to get any feedback that you have to offer. So I'd like to start by thanking you all for coming, and thank you also to the philosophy department here for enabling this visit, especially to Professor Poram Jung. Let's see. Okay. I have not done it this particular way, so this could take me. It might take me a little while to. So I can't necessarily read from here. All the slides are like in 6 fonts. So I'll be reading this way. So those of you who are at home, you'll see like the side of my face most of the time. Okay.
Change the view.
All right. Maybe just this like.
Sorry. Which one?
Maybe this one. I think this one's the far right one. I mean, maybe the reverse. Yeah, this one would be dark, and those would be on.
I don't think I understand.
Oh, I do.
Doing the same thing.
Oh, that was good. Yeah.
All right. What I'll try to do is talk through as much of the through the PowerPoint slide as possible, kind of keep it fresh. Although there could be a couple times where I think I do have to consult my paper, partly because otherwise it will take me 20 minutes to talk through some of this stuff. It's just quicker sometimes just to read. Okay, so a little bit of context. So for those of you familiar with philosophy of race, in the last maybe 20 to 25 years, there's been ever more increasingly sophisticated accounts of racism. But very little of it has been on anti-Asian racism. The paradigm is anti-Black racism. And part of it has to do, I think, with the fact that civic narratives of racism tend to prioritize anti-Black racism. And therefore, theoretical accounts of racism have tended to prioritize anti-Black racism. And as far as I'm concerned, we need more accounts of anti-Black racism. So this is not an objection to that work. What I'm suggesting, however, is that we can expand the paradigm to think more widely about how racism or white supremacy is operated in the US. A lot of what I have to say will focus on anti-Asian racism, especially in regard to concept of cultural alienness or xenophobia. But I think this can be applied to some elements of anti-Latino or Latinx racism, anti-MENA or Arabic, Middle Eastern or Muslim racism or Islamophobia as well. Here, I'm just going to focus on Asian Americans. It's what I know best, and then also just simplify the talk. Okay, so I think also another feature of this is not just about what sometimes people call the black-white binary being the paradigm, but also a lot of philosophical work, I think because it's philosophical, tends towards abstraction. We want accounts that cover as many cases as possible. And so there hasn't been, I think, enough meso-level or middle-level theorizing. It tends to be very, very abstract with very concrete examples. And I think there's a continuum of specificity, and a lot of the middle ground has been left kind of underdeveloped. And if we think through some of the meso-level elements, I think we get a clearer sense of anti-Asian racism, Islamophobia, et cetera, anti-Latinx racism, et cetera. So another part of the context here is obviously the recent spike in anti-Asian racism in the COVID era. But I think it's not just that. I think that even if there wasn't this COVID context for the spike in anti-Asian racism, ongoing tensions with China and North Korea, parts of South and Western Asia, and the war on terrorism, I think these would make anti-Asian racism persist. And therefore, the gap in theorizing about anti-Asian racism would persist. So, so this is just the paper today is a contribution to trying to fill a little bit of the gap. Okay, there's a lot of work in the field of Asian American studies that deals with this work, but in philosophy, not so much. And so I'll be talking a little bit about the work of Claire Jean Kim. She's a political theorist, political scientist, Her work has been widely cited in Asian American studies. It has some value for philosophers as well. I'll get to that a little bit later. Also, by considering anti-Asian racism at the meso level, I think we get some diagnostics on failures of democracy. I think democracy is a very complex achievement, and we achieve it by gradations. And so getting a sense of anti-Asian racism might help us think about certain mechanisms of democracy that could be improved. But for the purpose of this paper, I'll focus mostly on diagnostics, things that go wrong, rather than offering constructive proposals how a more robust democracy might be achieved. Okay. And, oops. Okay, so in terms of the paper layout, 2 parts. I'm going to try to clarify xenophobia as a distinctive element in anti-Asian racism. And I'll offer some critical revision or emendations to Claire-Jean Kim's classic work. And I regard the remarks that I'll direct towards Claire-Jean Kim as kind of sort of like in-house nitpicking. So I do consider myself an ally of her work. I love her work. She's no kin of mine, by the way. I don't personally know her, but I love her work, and I'd like to offer some sort of in-house criticism of it. But the majority of the paper will be focused on the second element, the related phenomenon of xenophilia, the attraction towards alterity or difference. That seems to be a counterpart of xenophobia. Doesn't get talked about quite as much, except in a very specific instance of what's sometimes called racial fetishism. That'll occupy my concerns at the end of the paper. And one thing that I'll do when I discuss xenophilia is I'd like to not so much give an account of how bad racial fetishism is, although I will offer considerations for its condemnation. My concern more is with normative mapping. Like what are the range of evaluations that we can direct towards xenophilia? Are there some types of xenophilia that are not problematic? I'm going to argue yes. There are some types that are not problematic. And then for those kinds that are problematic, how and why are they problematic? Right? And I'll talk about at least 3 types of unethical xenophilia, the third of which is a very complicated case, even though it's taken to be, many people assume that it's obviously bad. Right? So let me make my way through this stuff then. Okay, so first, xenophobia and civic ostracism. So, three general points, and I'll get into each of these. So I think it's clear that a dominant historical pattern in Asian racialization is Asians being regarded as culturally alien, odd, distant. I'm going to suggest this, and here I'm drawing on some earlier work that my colleague von Sundstrom and I did, where we think that the pattern here should be captured in terms of the notion of civic ostracism. This is a phrase that actually Claire-Jean Kim uses. We'll tweak it in particular ways, and we suggest that the phrase xenophobia, even with its limitations, still be preserved. I'll say more about that in a moment. And then finally, I'll say a little bit about the Claire-Jean Kim model. Okay. So in terms of historical patterns, I think there's so much consolidated research on this point and so much common agreement that Asians have been historically regarded as culturally different or odd. And in some cases, it has been metaphysically loaded up so that people think that Asians are essentially culturally different. And that has been sometimes intermixed with racial thinking. So the idea of cultural difference is purely about socialization. Different cultures, different socializations. So this is purely a sociological phenomenon. But the way, for example, US history is unfolded, a lot of this has been explicitly racialized. There's some peculiar, irrational fusions of racial thinking with sociological thinking, right? So that people are, Asians are thought to be racial, biologically, culturally different, right? Just because it doesn't make sense doesn't mean that it hasn't been that way, right? Okay. So sometimes, though, the idea of Asians as cultural alien has been linked to certain types of psychological claims that somehow the sedimentation of their cultural ways is so deep that they cannot assimilate to American life ways. So that doesn't necessarily have to be an essentialist claim in some grand metaphysical sense. It could be it could be posturing as some type of social scientific claim. And so, I mean, sometimes I give this as an example. This is borrowed from the philosopher Owen Flanagan, but all of us here probably are accustomed to typing by means of a QWERTY keyboard, right? In the upper left is QWERTY. There are actually other types of keyboards. There's like the Dvorak keyboard. If somebody switched the keyboard on you so it's not QWERTY, that would so mess with your daily life. Because we are so QWERTified, right? So deeply, it's hard to imagine a different type of keyboard, right? And some people have thought that Asians have been so deeply culturally different that it would be like shifting like the keyboard to something other than QWERTY, right? Sometimes there's an epistemic dimension that's added to Asians' cultural difference. They're somehow inscrutable. So the ways are somehow defy epistemic access. And sometimes it gets linked to certain types of aesthetic evaluations as there's something peculiarly pleasing about the difference of Asians. And this last point often gets connected to with issue at the intersection of race and gender with regard to Asian and Asian American women, something I'll talk about towards the end of this essay. But anyways, I think it's clear, as far as I know, nobody has ever challenged this thesis. Right? Seems to be like a really obvious point about how Asians have been racialized. But I think the real issue then is like how to characterize it. But before we get into the characterization of this point, I love this case as an exemplary remark on Asians' cultural difference. So for the longest time, I don't know about y'all, but for a while, like Justice Harlan was a little bit of a hero to me. When Plessy versus Ferguson was established by the Supreme Court, right, in the late 19th century, Justice Harlan, in an epic dissent, said, no, separate but equal is actually just segregation. There's something racist, anti-Black about this type of segregation, right? And he was defying the rest of the Supreme Court. And then I read on, I found out Justice Harlan had this to say. He was really like pro-Black. But here's his remarks on the Chinese. There is a race so different from our own that we do not permit those belonging to it to become citizens of the United States. Persons belonging to it are, with few exceptions, absolutely excluded from our country. I allude to the Chinese race, but by the statute in question, a Chinaman can ride in the same passenger coach with white citizens of the United States, while citizens of the Black race cannot. And I always thought that was kind of like a really powerful reminder of how deep some of this can go, even by otherwise very justice-oriented thinkers. So why the word xenophobia to capture the phenomenon of civic ostracism? Here, my colleague Ron Sundstrom and I, we tried to come up with words, and some of them I had to write down. We could use the word misogynomy. So that's like the hatred of alienness. That's not gonna work. You can't even say the word, right? Another one is heterophobia. That's actually clear, right? Fear of difference, but then heterophobia sounds too much like heterosexual. It brings in another set of connotations. So that could potentially be confusing. So just in deference to common parlance, we should just use xenophobia. However, unlike the etymological suggestion that this is fear or phobia of the xenos or difference or the alien, we want to broaden the concept of xenophobia so that the concept is informed. So we want to turn it into a term of art, right? Not preserve the original etymological meaning. So xenophobia is some type of exclusion from the civic on the basis of cultural difference, right? It could involve phobia or fear. It could involve hate. It could just have beliefs that these people don't belong here, right? It could take the form of policies. It can configure institutions. So it doesn't even have to be personal in the way that xenophobia, the etymological sense of xenophobia suggests. So we want to broaden the concept of xenophobia. So it's sort of like the way philosophers have discussed the nature of like sexism homophobia also has been kind of removed from its etymological root. So it's not just fear of same-sex union, right? There could be policies that are homophobic, and that's the way in which we want to use xenophobia. So we'll just defer to common parlance and keep using the word xenophobia, but just understand it as a term of art, where this is about civic exclusion that could take institutional, policy, social, cultural, and individual forms, and need not even involve fear. Right? So why briefly does civic ostracism matter? And here, let me just very quickly read a little bit of the paper. Sundstrom and I thought one way to put this is in terms of political liberalism. Like, what would be a way to describe civic ostracism in a way that, for example, John Rawls would appreciate? So let's go kind of straight down the middle here, right? So that you don't have to be some type of radical in order to appreciate what is deprived of us through xenophobia, right? So, okay. So the principal core meaning of xenophobia is civic exclusion or civic ostracism. The idea is centered on the notion that inclusion in the civic mainstream is a precondition for certain social goods, including officially recognized and sanctioned social relations, and is itself a good, and thus its denial through ostracism, whether intentional or neglectful, is morally condemnable. Civic inclusion is a social good because possession gives a person the kind of agency that befits life in a modern polity and facilitates fulfillment within it. Specifically, in modern nations, denizens need to have an abiding sense of meaningful possibilities of action, identity, and relationship formation within institutions, associations, and public spheres generally. And importantly, these possibilities must be, in principle, equal to those of their denizen peers and socially accepted by a significant proportion of them. Political agency will be enhanced when the socially resonant sense of possibilities includes a sense of reasonable and fair access to goods, jobs, relationships, and statuses comparable to those of one's peers. It should also involve a sense of legitimacy in claiming the full complement of rights that protect or enable fulfillment within the polity. Finally, it should be infused by a confidence in the cultural legitimacy of historically and non-normative identities and cultural practices. Importantly, this is not merely an attitude or outlook of the agent. As noted, it must be socially accepted or communally sanctioned. There needs to be some type of cyclical or reciprocal process here. Clearly, this is crucial for the enactment of the sense of possibility, since without such acceptance or sanction, others may thwart one's efforts. But it's also vital for the very formation and maintenance of that basic structure of engagement or aspiration, for there will be some sort of calibration or attunement between the agent's sense of possibilities and the kinds of approval, accommodation, or denial regularly experienced in the course of enacting that sense. Thus, an enabling sense of meaningful possibilities in a modern polity is itself a good, and as implied, it facilitates access to other goods, even those that are central to political liberalism. For example, self-respect and meaningful choice have as their ordinary context such an agent's sensibility being consistently, albeit imperfectly, affirmed by denizen peers, especially during formative stages of an agent's development, end quote. All right, so the civic inclusion, I think, is something that's a bit under-theorized. And so no wonder xenophobia is sometimes underappreciated as a deprivation in the modern polity, right? And if this is a way of characterizing specifically anti-Asian racism and perhaps other types of racism at the meso level, then it's useful to think about what's at stake here, right? What kind of damage civic ostracism does, but we don't have to appeal to some radical political theory, but even just like mainstream Rawlsian theory can appreciate. Okay, and something that Sundstrom and I want to emphasize is there's a way in which a lot of philosophers of race have been trying to talk about xenophobia as a sub-process of racism only. And it's that last thing only where we disagree. So oftentimes racism can employ xenophobia, sexism, etc. Right? These things are tangled up in complex ways, but sometimes xenophobia can operate independently or autonomously. right? And so what we want to argue for is a relative autonomy of xenophobia. And so there's a more complex intersectionality with regard to xenophobia, sexism, homophobia, racism, etc. And then here's a couple cases. Like around 2020, there was, I don't know if people kept up with the news in Southern Africa at the time, but something that splashed the headliners was there was a great deal of violence by those living in South Africa towards their African neighbors who were coming across the border to find employment in South Africa. So this is black on black harassment and sometimes even violence. And one of the things that was often cited was xenophobia as the cause for this, right? And here's one refugee from the Congolese refugee in regard to his experience when he crossed the border to South Africa seeking employment. Quote, I was selling clothes on the street when 9 South Africans carrying jambos, that's like a whip, and sticks came. They were beating people, shouting, you foreigners go home. We don't need you here. You're taking our jobs and money. I started to run away, but I was beaten and my 2 bags of clothes were taken. And the way a lot of journalists characterize, social scientists characterize the phenomenon in terms of xenophobia, it wasn't obviously racialized. Right? So this would be a case where you have non-racial xenophobia. It's quite substantial. Right? Another case might be right now with the Russia-Ukraine war. I have some Russian students who have talked about how they distinctively have felt they're not sure how American they are, even though they've grown up in the US. That then all of a sudden, as Russian Americans, they feel a little bit like potentially like foreigners. And sometimes I comment that, oh, it's interesting. A lot of Asians, Latinos, etc., feel this similarly. And not to say that it's a good thing that you're experiencing this, but and I've noticed that in San Francisco, a friend of mine in New York said, whenever you have Russian restaurants or stores, almost all of them are draped in Ukrainian flags because they feel an intense vulnerability, some type of xenophobic backlash by Americans, even if these Russians reject Putin, reject the war, even if they are genuinely pro-Ukrainian, they want to advertise themselves as being pro-Ukrainian. Right? And as far as I know, there's no, the Russians are still considered white in the US. Right? So this would be another case of the relative autonomy of xenophobia. Now, of course, when xenophobia and racism converge, racism, sexism, and racism, it can become more powerful, but our point simply is there's some relative autonomy to xenophobia, and it can get underappreciated when we focus on black-white relations, or when we have this really abstract concept of racism that thinks about racism in terms of simply like hatred or contempt or inferiorization, stuff that I'll get to in just a moment. Okay, so here's Claire Jean Kim. She offers a really nice articulation of this. She talks about a field of racial positions by which Asian Americans are racially formed through a triangulation process. We can't divorce the racialization of Asians from blacks from whites. Many efforts have been made to try to think about black-white racialization, white-Asian, but maybe these are actually much more entwined than we realize. And we think about them together, we get a clearer sense of how they've been racialized. So how does this work? Well, she has a graph. I've tried to do justice to her graph. It's super helpful to see it visualized, right? So you have on this x-axis here, civic ostracism, or what Sundstrom and I call xenophobia. So if you're towards 0, then you're considered an outsider. So bad, right? That's xenophobia. And as you move out along the x-axis towards infinity, then you are more of an insider, so you're more accepted, right? And on the vertical or the y-axis, it might be hard to see from the seats there, but this is what's a process that she calls relative valorization. I think what she means is generic racial valorization, how you rank races in some generic sense, right? And so towards 0 is inferior, and the more superior you're regarded is towards infinity, right? And so she suggests that so white Americans, one way in which their privileges or advantages are expressed are that on the x-axis, they're considered more insiders. They're the most American of Americans, and it gives them many types of advantages. Right? In terms of relative valorization, they're considered to be the most superior race in this country. And so they're positioned as the purple region here. Blacks have generally been thought to be distinctly American. And they have had a powerful presence in terms of civic narratives about racism. Right? Frederick Douglass is often cited even by the Republican Party, it's not just Democrats. Right? But they have been, in terms of relative valorization, they've been clearly far more dehumanized than Asians have, and certainly far more than whites have. And so we might think about Asians then, so as here, blacks, right? They're insiders in terms of Americanness, but deeply dehumanized in terms of relative valorization processes. Right? And Asian Americans have been somewhere in the middle in terms of relative valorization. And this comes out in a pronounced way more recently with the model minority concept that kind of puts Asians between whites and blacks and pits Asians against blacks. But in terms of civic ostracism or xenophobia, they've been clearly thought to be outsiders for a whole host of reasons. Right? So I think Claire Dean Kim's field of racial positions graph is a useful way of characterizing xenophobia. It's a really nice model, I think. Okay. So here are 3 types of replies. Again, they're friendly replies to Claire Jean Kim. One is diagnostic. We want to insist that xenophobia as civic ostracism, not simply fear of the xenos, has an autonomous logic. Right? In real life cases, sometimes it does, in fact, intertwine with racism. No problem there, but it does have an autonomous logic. And so we need a stronger sort of intersectionality. So if we think about the X and Y axis, the relative valorization can be racial in the way that she suggests. It can also be cultural. Right? In terms of the Y axis, civic ostracism, the X axis, civic ostracism, it can be racial in the way she suggests. It can be also purely cultural as well. So both the X and the Y axis can be racially modulated or purely culturally, civically modulated. Right? Whereas for her, she uses this expression, cultural hyphen racial reasons. She unites them. We want to separate them. Right? In actual practice, they often do unite. So there's nothing wrong with what she says, but we want to leave open the possibility sometimes xenophobia may spike without racism. And sometimes racism, when it unites with xenophobia, is stronger, not just because racism is involved, but because xenophobia is also very powerful and hugely depriving of generates deprivation harms in people. Okay, so that's one diagnostic point. Just in terms of value to frame, we think that she introduces the word civic ostracism, which we've adopted, and we say that let's go even further. Like, what exactly does it mean to be ostracized from the civic? What do we lose when we're ostracized? And that's something that's not entirely clear in your work, but in the passage that I explained in my paper. We think that we can better frame what is actually lost in xenophobia. And so it's not just racism, which is certainly true, but also there are all kinds of deprivations from the civic mainstream which harm denizens of a country. And finally, constructive, this builds on number 2. If we have a clear sense of what's lost because of this type of diagnostic, and potentially we have more constructive remarks to make about how a more robust democracy can be achieved. Okay, so let me just move forward. Actually, maybe I could just kind of pause for a moment. If people have any questions, and I can move on to xenophilia. Yes.
I missed the first part, so I just wanted a little clarification of the differences between maybe something like racism, bigotry, and xenophobia.
Oh yeah. Oh, actually, I'm going to get to racism and xenophobia. Let me hold off on that thing. It'll come up a little bit later. Yeah. Although bigotry, I haven't talked about. I'm not. Maybe depending on how bigotry is defined, maybe it will be covered by a future slide here. Anything like particularly perplexing? Okay. All right. So xenophilia. Yeah, so this seems to be like generally xenophobia is some type of aversion or exclusion of that which is regarded culturally alien. Xenophilia is some type of attraction to that which is regarded as culturally different, some type of alterity, right? And this is clearly of concern because when we start to think about race, gender, and culture together, racial fetishism, exoticization emerge as really important elements of anti-Asian racism, especially in regard to Asian American women. But this also comes up in terms of LGBTQ plus literature with regard to Asian men and white male counterparts. There's been a fair amount that's been written there as well, but recent Atlanta murders raises this in a particularly powerful way. Also, there's some complexity here with xenophilia because it involves a positive regard, at least on the face of it. It's not hateful in any obvious sense. If you say it's hateful, you have to do a lot of work to show that there's hatred. So there's some type of positive regard. Also, the positive regard, here's something that concerned me a great deal. The positive regard is actually potentially linked to things that we often regard as virtues, being open-minded, curious, right? And by the end of the paper, I'm going to talk about some shifting trends in the feminist literature on sexual objectification. But okay, so let me move forward with xenophilia. First, let me just kind of clarify that the project here is not to show how bad xenophilia can be. I think something like the Atlanta murders clarifies like how bad it can be. If you know anything about the literature of pornography and violence towards Asian American women or Asian women, it's quite serious. But here, I want to think about, kind of move away from this a little bit, just kind of get like a normative mapping of like, what are the bad, what the wrongness of xenophilia generally? What cases might be actually not immoral? And when it is unethical, how and why is it unethical? Okay. So here's a little bit of prelude. Why even think that there could be unproblematic kinds of xenophilia? I just quickly go through this. When I gave an earlier version of this paper, I think 30 minutes of the Q&A was on this. We'll see what you all think. All right, so xenophilia, first I want to clarify that there's a number of ways in which it can be appraised or condemned, right? It could be irrational, stupid, silly, shallow, petty, all those things, right? But my concern is with the ethical or the moral. Also, yeah, I've already mentioned this. It seems at the face of it positive. And finally, it's linked to various kinds of virtues. Right? So here's some considerations for morally unproblematic kinds of xenophilia. So one case is the phenomenon of white scholars who are fascinated by, say, Buddhism and seek to learn, say, Sanskrit or classical Chinese to read sutras in their original languages. If you've ever been to the Society for Asian Comparative Philosophy or the Continental Circle for Comparative Philosophy, they're actually white dominant spaces, even though the focus is on Asian philosophy. I'm not necessarily objecting to that, right? In fact, my point here is that insofar as they have this strong fascination with Asian culture, say Buddhism, right? They're intrigued by Buddhist arguments for anti-essentialism, for humans being mereological sums of their parts, and they're fascinated by the fact that whole cultures can be organized around these anti-essentialist concepts, which is very different than say the US, where everyone talks about a long-lasting soul, immaterial soul, etc. And they actually want to inform their work, but they will spend years in graduate school studying this stuff. This is not like superficial cosmopolitanism, right? They will even, I don't know about you, but learning a second language, especially these ones that don't have any connection to the Romance languages. If you grew up in the US, like Sanskrit or classical Chinese, that's not easy. Going from like English to French, not so bad, right? But we're going from English to Sanskrit. Just the syntactical barriers is like so hard, right? In classical Chinese as well. And they put in all that time to learn these languages. They're like very serious about it. They really want to understand or know, right? Insofar as it's not superficial, they're willing to put the work in it. They regard Sanskrit and classical Chinese as serious philosophical languages, not just Greek, German, and French, right? And put in that sort of thing. Maybe that's unproblematic xenophilia. Here's another one. Farhan Godrej brings this up. Like, how do we get past Eurocentrism? She suggests that one, it's so hard to give a fair shake to non-Western traditions. Like, I always bring this up in my classes. Like, have any of you ever seriously given thought to a non-democratic form of government? Not just to, like, obviously to criticize it, yeah, but not to criticize it. Like, take it seriously, because so many countries in the world do not have democracies, right? And many non-Western traditions have non-democracies, right? So, for example, there's a huge debate right now in Western Chinese scholarship about whether Confucian meritocracy is a viable modern alternative to democracy, right? But it's hard to actually grant enough to these alternative worldviews. And she suggests we adopt a perspective of adherence. It's almost like Husserl is. It's like adopting a particular stance, right? It's like pretend like you're a believer in the position in order to give as fair a shake to this alternative worldview as possible. That starts to sound a little bit like xenophilia. So one way to read Godrej is that maybe xenophilia made methodological is one way to actually overcome Eurocentrism. That's just another type of thought to consider. Here's another one, conversion. Somebody, a Christian for the first time, takes Judaism seriously, decides to convert. Should we say that's bad? Because they have so taken they taken Judaism seriously. Or how about the reverse? Somebody like wants to, maybe has grown up in a context where like deeply anti-Christian, right? And maybe they want to give Christianity a fair shake, and they're very serious about it. Sometimes we have these conversion moments, and we don't want to automatically say conversion is bad, right? Okay, if I had more time, I talk about this journalist Paul Sapolet. But I think maybe that's enough to kind of motivate a case for unproblematic types of xenophilia. And also one last point about cultures themselves. I think most historians are pretty clear on this, that cultures involve actually interculturalism. There's a lot of hybridization that gets involved. Sometimes it has to do with things like conquest and imperialism, but sometimes it has to do with people just being curious about other cultures. There's a lot of more, nowadays people think about migration as a modern problem, but it's actually all the way into the prehistory of human beings, right? And one of the things that's involved in the confluence and creation of cultures is curiosity about otherness, right? So maybe there are some types of unproblematic xenophilia. Right? Okay, but there are clearly problematic forms. Let's switch over to these. Here are at least three possible ways to evaluate immoral or unethical xenophilia. Two of them are causal and one is intrinsic. One is the idea that xenophilia can be unethical, problematic, because it directly oppressively impacts the targets of xenophilic regard. So something like yellow fever, right? The effects that it has on Asian women or Asian American women is one reason why it's unethical. I'll talk about this through the article of Robin Zheng in just a moment. Another is a little bit indirect. Maybe it's also a causal argument. It supports certain types of ideologies which subordinate Asian or Asian American women or Asians or Asian Americans generally in a variety of ways. But this is a little bit more like a distal causal impact. And finally, this is, I think, maybe the hardest point to make. Something about xenophilic regard is constitutively immoral, especially because it's constitutively racist. It's a claim. I want to suggest in a moment that it's not obvious that we can argue this way. We might be able to get the condemn it by switching to feminist literature on sexual objectification, but even that is a little bit unclear. So 3 is sort of one of the more complex types of disagreements. So let's start with direct oppressive impact. So Robin Zheng has this great essay called "Why Yellow Fever Isn't Flattering." It came out in the journal of the APA about maybe 4 or 5 years ago. She wants to criticize what she calls the mere preference argument. So it goes something like this: if attraction to height or eye color is unproblematic, and sexual or romantic attraction, then neither is attraction to racialized phenotypic features like skin tone, hair texture. Right? Some people really like taller people. Okay, fine. Nobody like bats an eye about that. But then if it has to do with skin tone, eye shape, all of a sudden it seems to be problematic, right? But if this is not problematic, then neither should this be. That's the mere preference argument. She thinks that this is a very common way of ignoring the seriousness of yellow fever. Right? So her argument and strategy is she wants to actually say that maybe let's set aside for the moment evaluating the internal structure or the intrinsic elements of the perception that someone with yellow fever would have towards, say, Asian women or Asian American women. And instead focus on the impact, the downstream of this type of regard. That's her argument and strategy. And much of her essay is about showing that the entrenched, ubiquitous, and often obfuscated social meanings in anti-Asian racism and sexism about Asian women being demure, submissive, etc., willing to please, etc., that the cumulative psychological toll of being otherized, depersonalized, homogenized, this constitutes a significant oppressive disadvantage for Asian and Asian American women. And she thinks that this is a way of launching a response to the mere preference argument that doesn't get into the complex psychology of the person who has yellow fever. Right? So she relies on the verbal reports of a range of Asian and Asian American women and to suggest that the cumulative psychological toll is a significant disadvantage. Right? So that's at least one way that someone could argue for the wrongness of racial xenophilia, right? Direct oppressive impact. Right? Okay. We could take a leaf from some early Marxist literature as well as Robin Jenks. So let's go Marxist-like, just drawing loosely from Marx. So take the idea of ideology as a set of concepts that supports a practice of typically material subordination by justifying or normalizing the subordination. Right? I don't think you need to be a Marxist. You could be a Rawlsian and endorse this notion of ideology. Although interesting, Rawls never talks about this. He should, but even a liberal could accept this very loosened version of ideology. Right? So philosophers, I think, sometimes forget that just because you've logically refuted a stereotype that's a part of ideology doesn't necessarily mean you stop the social force that the representation has. And here, so we're concerned with the social force that ideas have. Right? Xenophilia clearly employs and sustains representations that are part of the ideological face of the subordination of Asian American women. So like the sexual stereotypes of a demure Asian woman, they can be activated in so many other contexts, like dismissing an Asian woman candidate for a leadership position because she's thought to be too submissive or too demure, right? Or take the recent pattern of assaults during this COVID era. The vast majority of people who are being attacked and killed are the elderly and Asian American women, right? And the idea that they are somehow demure or submissive makes them easy scapegoats for this type of COVID era assault. Right? So here you have at least a couple ways. So in this type of way of condemning racial xenophilia is compatible with the Zheng account. So the Zheng account is direct oppressive impact on the people who are perceived in yellow fever. Here, this is a little bit more remote. It sustains this ideology that can be activated in a variety of contexts. Right? There's no reason to deny one or the other. You can accept both, right? But they're both the structure of the normative structure of these critiques. They involve causation. Right? Okay, so let's move on to the hardest one. Is there something intrinsically wrong? Right? Not just about the causation, but something wrong in and of itself. And this is often put in terms of racial fetishism. So racial xenophobia is racial fetishism. Racial fetishism is racist, and therefore it's constitutively wrong. Right? Okay, so let me, here's one encapsulation of this common idea. This is from Jean Namgo. So, quote, though many understand racism to be discrimination against select races, to cherry pick a culture and assume that each individual from that group will embody the stereotypes that have been imposed on them is dehumanizing. racial fetishism is racism. This is like a very strong claim, right? So how might we cash out this type of criticism? Let's see what kind of help we can get from philosophy of race. So Lawrence Blum has a really well-known account of racism. He argues in terms of two modes. One is the idea of race-based inferiorization of a group. He thinks that's clearly racist, right? You can have also race-based antipathy towards a group. And so these two cores or paradigms can anchor our thinking about what racism is. One problem though is it's not obvious that racial fetishism necessarily inferiorizes a person. Now, a person may feel inferiorized, but does the person who has yellow fever or xenophilia mean to inferiorize him? They might actually appreciate the person or think they are appreciated. Right? So it's not obvious that there's race-based inferiorization of Asian or Asian American women, or men for that matter. And it doesn't seem to be antipathy, unless, like in the case of the Atlanta murders, you have a second order desire not to have sexual attraction, in which case you might have antipathy, right? But in the xenophilia itself, there does not seem to be antipathy. So if we go by the Blum model to try to make sense of how racial xenophilia is racial fetishism is intrinsically racist, it's not clear that Blum's model helps us. How about Jose Garcia's volitional model? This is also like a really well-known account in philosophy where he thinks that we should think in terms of vices, especially emotionalized disregard for the well-being of others. Things like obviously racial hate, but it could even involve things like racial coldness towards people when empathy is due. Right? Yes, that's a little bit more flexibility perhaps, but it's not clear that racial fetishism necessarily involves a disregard for the well-being of the other. So in some cases, racial fetishism, so somebody might think that they're simply doing what is appropriate given the types of relations that exist, the attributes of the person that they're romantically attracted to. And of course, racial fetishism can be theorizing, have empathy, but it doesn't necessarily have to have these features. So it's not clear whether these two models from a philosophy of race can assist it. Here's, I think, one way to think about the argument a little bit more explicitly. So premise one would be something like in racial fetishism, the person or target is aesthetically or romantically selected or favored exclusively and intensively in terms of racial gendered body parts, and sometimes also psychological traits. To aesthetically or romantically prefer someone in terms of body parts or stereotypes, traits, is to reduce the person to an object or instrument. 3, reduction to an object or instrument is an unethical form of regard. Thus, racial fetishism is constitutively unethical, even if the person or target does not mind being fetishized. So this is a broadly Kantian argument. I think this is the way a lot of thinking proceeds, right? So is there a way to condemn this type of racial xenophilia that doesn't appeal to Blum or Garcia? Well, maybe we ought to switch to condemning it not on racist grounds, but on sexist grounds, switching to the feminist literature on sexual objectification. And so if you take premise 2, to aesthetically or romantically select someone in terms of body parts or stereotype traits is to reduce the person to an object or instrument. It turns out actually there's a lot of recent feminist work on sexual objectification by people like Raja Halwani, Nina Papadaki, Nancy Bauer, and others who have been arguing that there's actually a lot of ambiguity to this notion of to reduce. And, it sometimes kind of spoils the meanings prematurely. Right? So something that they point out, the sexual attraction, we have to remember, this is not like doing Wordle or Sudoku. It is a clearly an embodied process, right? Where there is a pronounced focus on body parts, right? And that this is actually potentially compatible with respectful limits on what goes on in sexual interaction. And also there may be a wider attention to the person in non-sexual contexts. Right? So it's not as if you're focusing on body parts with regard to the other person in all contexts, right? Or that it somehow opens the floodgates so you can just do whatever you want in a sexual encounter. So they want to suggest that when 1 and 2 hold, right, their respectful limits in the sexual encounter, there's wider attention to the person in non-sexual context, then is it actually reduction? And they want to kind of dislodge our conviction here, right? See if it dislodges yours. Right? What about premise 3? Reduction to an object or instrument is an unethical form of disregard. The challenge from the foregoing author is something like, if reduction already implies disrespect, then of course sexual objectification as reduction is immoral. But we're back to the issue of premise 2. Is it actually reduction when you have respectful limits in the sexual encounter and you don't necessarily sexualize a person in non-sexual contexts? Is it actually reduction then? It is all, after all, sex, right? And they go on to say that, so some even have argued that treating people as an instrument more generally may not necessarily be immoral. This is kind of an unusual thought. I'm not sure how far I want to go with this, but this is an interesting thought here. For example, mail carriers, accountants, cashiers, we often treat them as instruments. And we as customers may be treated as an instrument. But insofar as moral boundaries are respected, maybe there's no problem here. And in some cases, I forgot, I think this could be McLeod who brings this point up. Some may even want to be treated a little bit more like an instrument, especially when one becomes elderly or due to infirmity, their what was earlier natural ability has been lost. Sometimes people put it this way: I just wish I could be more useful, right? So maybe not all cases of instrumentalization are immoral. Some people have argued. Hawani says that maybe what it really boils down to is we have to make a clean distinction between reductive regard and reductive treatment. Reductive treatment is wrong, but maybe reductive regard, there's nothing constitutively wrong with it in sexist terms or racist terms. Right? At most, we can make a case in terms of causal impact. At least that's all I have for you today. Thanks. I'm sorry, I went over your voice. Yeah.
If you want to pull it up.
Okay, so here's one. Oh, should I take up the chat questions first? Or?
Oh, sure.
Okay, so there's one from Jennifer Ho. Quote, I know Dr. Kim likely can't see chat. I can see it, especially while he is lecturing, but I'm wondering how he feels about Leslie Bowe's latest book with Duke University Press entitled Racist Love, the basis of which comes from Frank Chin's essay on racist love in the Big IE, because she would say that some of his examples of Asian fetishization that seem unproblematic are in fact drivers of anti-Asian racism. Yeah, I have not read Leslie Bowe's recent book, but that's on my list to read for sure. Yeah, and let me say too that there are clearly many cases of xenophilia that can posture as being merely about curiosity and open-mindedness when it actually involves problematic racism. I don't want to deny that. I just want to suggest that there are some cases where it may not be that way. So there may be a lot more complexity in the genus that we call xenophilia. But yeah, I'll check out Leslie Bowe's argument in that book. Yeah, and there's another one here. Should I read that one or may I switch off?
One, yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah, sure.
Thanks for your talk, David. I sort of have two thoughts, one on xenophobia, one on xenophilia. Regarding xenophobia, I wonder if the relative autonomy from racism that you're talking about maybe isn't so much a separation from racism, but in fact is shaped by a different form of it. In the sense that I'm wondering, when in the examples that you gave, it seemed like part of what's at the source of xenophobia is kind of an investment in historically, I'm wondering where that comes from. And it seems to be tied to both, one, civilizational mappings of the world, which did hinge upon race, and two, the imposition of Western models of political regimes and sovereignty onto the rest of the world, as if that's the most ideal form of statecraft. And so I was curious as to whether or not there's a different way in which racism might be operative. I don't think that this discounts your distinction. I think it's actually very good. I'm just wondering if the relationship to racism might be a little bit more, tricky.
Yeah.
And then the second question that I had is in regards to xenophilia, and I think this is where I'm being challenged. And I think my question probably has to do with slide 8.
Okay.
Because I'm wondering what happens to the normative act of xenophilia if we don't take for granted the supposedly goodness of curiosity. Because when I hear things like curiosity, there is the kind of curiosity of like the classroom in a liberal arts education.
Yeah.
But then there's also the curiosity of, like, for example, scientific discovery and the kind of material conditions that are involved in pursuing it. So when I hear curiosity, for example, I'm thinking about people who want to build a telescope on Hawaii, saying that, yeah, I'm so curious about the cosmos.
Yeah.
This is the ideal place on the planet for us to undertake astronomical discovery. But then that comes at the cost of Native Hawaiians to say, well, this is actually a safe place for us.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if examples like that, perhaps, don't necessarily say that curiosity is not necessarily good, but perhaps slow us down to think about what are the value judgments that are attached to something. So if we start from there, I'm wondering what happens.
Okay. I totally appreciate these. These are great points. Yeah. So with regard to the first one, so if we think about, say, the 16th, 17th century racism like Bernier, Blumenbach, and others, that type of racism seems very different than, say, some modern versions of it. So we have to bear in mind how racism can shift. Any of these isms can involve complex shifts. And I totally agree with that. And I think the weight of history, the work of historians shows that this is clearly the case, right? We've moved from pre-Darwinian notions of racial seeds and racial blood, plasma, to Darwinian notions of racial genes and things like that. And people start to move away from that to talking about racial cultural concept, but also, as you point out, why even divide up the world in terms of nation states and configure nations in terms of civilizations? Has this not been a racialized or racial colonial project? Right? So I want to acknowledge that all this can be true. But I think I'd like to suggest maybe going back to the Congolese South Africa case and the Ukraine Russia cases, modern examples of how even if it's not racialized, there could be autonomous types of xenophobia. And I think the quick reaction that a lot of people have is to think that insofar as racism and xenophobia can come together, racism always hijacks xenophobia or something like that, perhaps in the formation of the modern nation state. And it could be the case, but I would like to see more historical evidence to show that it always is like that, right? I don't think it's a foregone conclusion because xenophobia can sometimes have some autonomous force. So maybe even if we had a very different history of the world where there was no Bernier and Blumenbach, none of these like a pentat of race and things like that, would there still be xenophobia? Could it still be consequential in the modern world? And it strikes me as that could very well be true. And so while racism might hijack nation building projects, employing civic exclusion and inclusion in racial terms, it doesn't seem to me like it necessarily has to be the case. And if we're more explicit about the potentially independent variable of xenophobia, that could potentially assist even historians to think more about how these things might sometimes separate so that we can get clear on when they do actually converge and reinforce each other. So I'm certainly open to that happening exactly the way you described it. The second point about the way I've set up the paper, I've set up curiosity as being a good thing, a virtue. But clearly there can be cases of curiosity that are vices, right? Especially if the curiosity leads to indigenous displacement. And I think my general take is that maybe there's a set of character traits, dispositions that we might call innocent until proven guilty. Like, for example, kindness, I think, is one of those cases, and so is curiosity, where it's good unless it's shown to be bad. There can clearly be bad kinds, or like maybe patience is another one. Actually, no, maybe not patience, but kindness and curiosity seem to be instances of that. Maybe care for one's parents. They're like good unless they're shown to be bad, right? There are wayward cases of curiosity, like you pointed out. There could be wayward cases of kindness too, like inappropriate generosity. And sometimes somebody needs a kick in the pants or something like that, not more kindness, right? But those are exceptions to the general rule, right? And so I think that's how I would want to present curiosity as a good. Not that it's always good, but it generally tends to be good. And generally we have to show that it's not good when it's not good. Right? Whereas something like hatred seems to be bad unless proven good, or something like that.
David, did you have
Oh,
questions still? Or? Oh, okay.
Well, thank you for the talk. I found this fascinating. So I
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I was thinking in terms of xenophilia, I was reminded of the recent discovery of mind by Emily Bernard, Black is the Body, where she talks about friendships, and she has white friends in Vermont who tell her, "You're my only black friend." And so she's concerned about the possibility of racism kind of skewing friendships. And but as I was thinking about this and looking at the discussion, it seemed to me that there's the possibility of an ethical analysis where ethical harm is done not to a person by inferiorizing them or expressing antipathy, but you're compromising a relationship, like friendship or some other relationship, where xenophilia or xenophobia might be analyzed in those terms. And in which case, we'd have to say something about friendship. What should friendship be, or some other kind of relationship?
So when in the case where someone says you're my only black friend, what does Emily Bernard say is damaging in that respect? I have some thoughts on that, but yeah, what does she say?
Yeah. So it's a wonderful memoir. There's a lot going on, but kind of as I'm thinking through of it, she says that she wants her friends to be aware of racism without awareness of racism being the center of the friendship. Where that the friendship is in a sense hijacked out of trying to address this real issue, right? And it seems to me I was thinking of this in terms of your array of unproblematic forms of xenophilia, where you might have a form of xenophilia where there's something problematic going on, right? And that's her concern. She hasn't formulated in these terms. It seems to me that's also the concern that she's expressing.
Yeah. I'm not sure if this would address your point, but I've had discussions with this with a variety of people, where it's kind of like, I don't know, what is the right word, like real talk about this kind of stuff. Like, I mean, a lot of people are at least initially attracted to another person for friendship or romance, where there's some type of racial xenophilia going on, right? And oftentimes it's like awful, you know, or sometimes in other categories it's just downright creepy or something like that. But sometimes what can happen too, you know, colleagues and friends of mine, we can try to give like real life examples. Sometimes it actually starts out epistemically and ethically problematic. Maybe like the fixation on the friend as being a black friend or something like that, right? But then that's just because things start poorly doesn't necessarily mean the agent can't recover. And sometimes people realize, you know, just by spending time with this, I realize you're much more multidimensional than I realized. And I realized that, yeah, I had these really screwed up stereotypes. I was excessively fixated on this or that. And I see a lot of complexity. It started out wrong, but it kind of ended up better or something like that. And I wonder, maybe in the case that you're describing, maybe it's something is revealed that it was very narrow or fixated, and maybe it never opened up to something wider and more complex. But oftentimes, I think things can start out with problematic xenophilia, but sometimes people recover, or as it were, they improve their outlook or something like that. I don't know if that addresses
Yeah,
your
no,
point.
I would hope so, but that's a possibility. Yeah, if we're interested in something like friendship philosophically, we can also address these issues.
Can I just add just a supplementary question to that? Is that an example, is Rob's example, the example of kind of meso level analysis that you gave some examples where the person who was harmed was a particular individual, and I'm just wondering, that was a really fascinating meso level.
Yeah. Potentially, is it maybe? I mean, it sounds almost like more micro than scenario. But what I meant by macro or the typical abstract stuff is like stuff like for Garcia. Blum says there are these two cores: inferiorization and antipathy. They seem to draw within the net on all cases of racism. Garcia tries to capture more cases, and he goes even more abstract. It's about vicious disregard or something like that. That sounds super abstract. And so, but talk about anti-Black racism in terms of bestialization and dehumanization of African Americans through slavery, that's still quite broad, but it's more middle level. Talking about anti-Asian racism in terms of xenophobia and how they typically excluded, or xenophilia as some type of reversal of this phenomenon, seems to be kind of like middle. It's still quite abstract, but descends from the cloudy heights of Garcia and Blum or something like that. Yeah, please.
Clarification question.
Yeah, awesome, thank you.
Slide in your last slide.
Oh, that's okay. Okay. Oops. Oh, there we go. Yes.
Specifically, the difference in the distinction between reductive regard and reductive treatment. If only the treatment is wrong, but if we buy that ideology feeds and maintains and forms cultural suppositions that then result in action, would that not also therefore?
Yeah. So, in terms of the way I've been trying to think about it is, so certain types of regard can be problematic because of the impacts directly in terms of those who are targeted, or indirectly because it supports ideologies which are subsequently in a variety of contexts subordinate. Right? But a lot of people want to up the ante and condemn xenophilia more strongly. There's something intrinsically or constitutively wrong with it. And I try to go through some literature in anti-racism, some of the literature in anti-sexism. It's hard to find an anchor point for how to condemn it as intrinsically wrong. And so Halwani suggests that maybe it's talking more about sexual objectification, but suggests that it might be really hard to condemn reductive regard, sexual objectification, but reductive treatment where we positively disrespect somebody, that seems clearly wrong. But it's hard to figure out what inside of the regard is wrong, right? Because it's not inferiorizing in any obvious sense. It's not antipathetic or hostile in any obvious sense. So maybe we can only rely on causal impact to condemn it, which is an interesting type of discovery. My initial impulse was to criticize it by any means possible, but then as I kept thinking about it, writing the theory, I thought, it's getting harder and harder to condemn this in terms of an intrinsic feature of the regard. Sure, yeah.
I think in response to your question, Spencer, it's not that, I think it's like the concept of all regard versus some types of regard. Because I think what you're saying about ideology feeding into it, I think that parts of ideology all parts of ideology. I mean, enough Marxism to speak on that, but it's the reductive portion. But I think that the previous slide actually answers that.
Yeah, I feel like this recent work in feminist literature, I'm trying to think more carefully about this word. This really is a go-to word. I find myself reflexively, that's so reductive, reduces a person to body part, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a kind of in the backdrop, shadowy backdrop, some type of broadly Kantian concern. We don't want to reduce people to certain parts or stereotypical traits, right? We want to appreciate their personhood, et cetera, et cetera. But with regard to sexual objectification, maybe it's actually not as easy to clarify when reduction takes place, and when it does, is it always necessarily wrong? There are a lot of paradigm cases where there's a lot of wrongness, right? But maybe if we try to normatively map the wrongness, maybe we need to allow for certain species of cases where it's not problematic, or it might be problematic for non-ethical reasons. Someone just being idiotic.
No. Leave my chicken alone.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I wonder, so just as an ideological point that occurred to me, about coincidence, when you were describing that chart, you had said that inclusion goes off.
Okay.
I don't know if that was just a turn of phrase or if that was a point about the graph itself. I wondered whether xenophilia, for example, considered apart from xenophobia, or is a consequence of the dialect allow every xenophobia altogether. Considered. And I think that if that chart really does go off into infinity, it makes me wonder about whether that represents a kind of ideology that you want to include that would resist it.
Yeah, let me think about this. That's interesting question. As far as I understand the Claire Jean Kim model, yeah, I'm sure she wants to bound it. It's a finite model, and so it wouldn't go off literally to infinity. But yeah, but the other point that you raised, whether xenophilia is dialectically related to xenophobia, it seems like, at least in the case of anti-Asian racism, that seems clearly to be the case. There's some type of dialectical relation, but there might be some cases of xenophilia that stand on their own. There's some type of curiosity that keeps on going. It's continues to be attracted to alterity, where it's potentially not problematic. But with regard to anti-Asian racism, all the cases of xenophilia that I can think of seem to have a relation to xenophobia. As you put it, they seem to be in some sense dialectically related. But could there be cases of xenophobia that are non-dialectical, and kind of stand on their own, as it were? It seems like there could be some cases like that. And they could potentially be problematic too, but not for ethical reasons. Maybe they're shallow. So a lot of xenophilia is quite shallow, right? Or petty, or something like, or just like weird, right? Or silly, right? Yeah, I'm going to keep thinking about that though. Thank you. All right. Thank you all in Zoom space.